here with James Carrion, former International Director of the Mutual UFO Network, or as it's known, MUFON. I was just wondering if maybe for my sake, but also for the sake of anyone who's listening, you could give us the background on who James Carrion is and how he got to where he is today and some of the things that we're going to be talking about.
Sure, Paul, and thank you for having me on your show. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've been interested in UFOs pretty much all my life. And as I got older and started thinking more about the subject, I really wanted to get more involved and try to figure out what this mystery was all about. So I joined MUFON, I think it was around 1996, here in Colorado, and volunteered for quite a bit at MUFON headquarters and eventually got on their board of directors. And then in 2006, when John Schuessler, who was then director, decided to retire, he was looking for somebody to replace him, and I put my name into the hat and was elected by the board of directors to be the next international director. And so I held that role for 3 years. That was the length of my term, but I was going to extend it another year until a suitable replacement could be found. I was supposed to officially relinquish the role in March of 2010, but some events that we'll probably be talking about led to me resigning before that. So pretty much an interest in the subject all my life. I also do have an intelligence background for a very short period of time when I was in the military.
When you started out, James, did you have a particular outlook on the UFO phenomenon? Were you a supporter of the extraterrestrial? Did you think they were aliens from Zeta Reticuli, or were you always sort of open-minded about it? What were your conclusions starting out, and have they changed over the years, and where would that sit now?
Well, when I first started off, like everybody else, it was reading information in the public domain, and of course I think the predominant message being pushed then was the ET hypothesis. And so of course, I thought maybe there was something to that. And I think, though, what probably has intrigued me the most is just that it's still a mystery. And I find it interesting found it very interesting that very sober and level-headed folks were still pursuing this subject. Folks with advanced degrees and lots of education, they were still interested in supposedly there's lots of current activity that would drive that belief. So yes, I think I started off probably like everyone else as a believer, though skeptical at heart. And then the more I delved into the subject, the more my beliefs started to change, and the more I started seeing these patterns of human involvement that really made me question whether or not there's a true phenomenon. If there's a true phenomena, at what level does it lie, and how many layers deep do you have to first unpeel before you can really reach this true phenomenon?
I guess the first place I want to start then, given that, is let's talk about MUFON. And I'll put it right to you, is MUFON still relevant?
Well, I believe they're still relevant. If you look at MUFON's mission statement, it's the scientific investigation of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. So just from the standpoint that there is no other organization, there are no group of scientists, there's no university with tenured professors that are scientifically investigating this subject. MUFON as an organization, if they would stick to their mission statement and actually do scientific investigation, is very relevant.
If you were still there, if you were running things, if you had your complete say, you were dictator for a day, and you could say, here's what MUFON needs to do, and here's how we're going to do it, what would that be?
Well, I think if you look back at the history of MUFON, they've been around a long time, and what is astounding to me is that the data they've collected as far as investigations is basically just that. It's just data. But what's very lacking in MUFON, and has always been lacking in MUFON, is a set of evidentiary standards for how that data is collected and how investigations are done. So in terms of data collection, I think that's what MUFON does. They go out there and their team of field investigators will investigate a case, they'll record the data, they'll send it off to headquarters, or it accumulates on the website, but nothing's done with the data. There's no massaging of the data. There's no actual number crunching. And so MUFON really can't do scientific investigation unless they have the funds and the credentialed folks that actually take data and do something with it. Collecting data itself is simply not going to lead them to the breakthroughs they're looking for. So I think if I were back in this position, basically is what I've always told the board of directors is we need to do something with our database. We can't just sit there and collect the data and just leave it there as a big black hole. We need to actually get folks involved in doing serious scientific analysis. And the problem is that the funds are simply not there for that. So MUFON has sort of been trudging along, barely in the black, and keeping the organization running, but they have no funds to actually do what they need to do.
In terms of the data collection, if you will, are the people that MUFON are using in the field qualified to do that? And my background is in history and in law, so I've always been a big proponent of training. Oral research methodology, for instance. Historians at a graduate level are taught how to interview people for oral histories. Lawyers are certainly taught how to ask questions, what questions to ask, more importantly, what questions not to ask. Are those kinds of people in MUFON? Are they the ones that are out in the field conducting these investigations? What kind of training do they get? Who is doing this kind of work is what I'm asking. And are they the right kind of people?
I think that there probably are people with the proper credentials in the organization that are doing field investigations. And when I mean proper credentials, I mean folks, as you have described, who have proper formal training, whether it's they're formal police or law enforcement officials, or they have backgrounds in some sort of investigative work. But I think probably the majority of folks that are currently certified as field investigators do not have those credentials. And so their training comes from what they glean from the MUFON Field Investigator Manual, or maybe partnering up with a more experienced investigator and sort of on-the-job training. But I think that those lack of credentials is actually what leads to the lack of consistent data collection. You know, for example, when you go out to the field and there's a report, you have to really, when you meet with those witnesses, really sit down and evaluate the witness from just a personal point of view of how truthful is this individual being, what would motivate them to come forward and give this report. So there's a lot of human interaction, or I should say, what's the proper, when you do an investigative technique, you really have to sit down and think about this witness and whether or not their report, if you were going to scale it on 1 to 10, is an accurate report? Is it something that they're motivated to make up? You know, there's the human factor. And I think often these investigators go out to the field and their own beliefs have clouded their ability to investigate and have clouded their ability to question. So they gloss over the human factor in these investigations, which in my perspective is always the most important.
If you want people with credentials to get involved, how would you go about doing that? Is it a publicity problem? Is it a PR problem for MUFON? Perhaps they're not able to get those kinds of people involved because the organization, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be professional. It doesn't have those kind of credentialed people. And it seems, to me at least, and I think to a lot of other people, that MUFON has already made up its mind about what the UFO phenomenon represents.
Sure, absolutely. I think that one of the biggest problems MUFON has is that the phenomena is so broad, and when you go to a MUFON symposium, when you have a scientist talking about some analysis they did on a case, but then the very next speech is somebody offering a very new age opinion about the subject, and then your next speaker is somebody talking about ancient astronauts. Well, there's an issue, because those folks who are scientifically minded, or who have science at heart, if they were to come to one of these symposiums and see that, they would walk away and say, okay, I don't want to be involved with this. I don't see any consistency here. I see this broad spectrum of activity with broad spectrum of opinion, but there's no way for me to sort of latch onto this and try to solve it from a scientific point of view. When you have, for example, the current international director giving speeches about alien artifacts on the moon with no evidentiary standard, no evidence of that whatsoever, that in a nutshell is the problem. You have a group of believers that have their opinion about what's happening, and they're trying to put the label of science on it, but that just doesn't fit. In fact, in the recent MUFON symposium, the board of directors actually communicated to their state directors that the reason I left the organization was because my truth was not the truth they were seeking. So when there's scientific truth, and that's pretty much it. Either science bears it out or not. But when you have even the leadership of this organization putting their own beliefs in the mix, it simply is not going to recruit the folks that are really needed to get to the heart of the problem.
Perhaps we can switch gears to the Robert Bigelow story within MUFON. And perhaps you can give us a bit of background about your involvement with that, how it all came about, and where it all might have gone wrong.
Sure. Well, what happened was that MUFON was approached in late 2008 by Mr. Bigelow, and he was looking for MUFON to conduct UFO investigations on behalf of his new startup company called BASS, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. So MUFON was basically assigned a purchase agreement where we were offering our services and access to our database for a fixed price. It was a fixed contract price per month, and the contract was going to be for a year. The problem that we had right off the bat was Mr. Bigelow was very adamant that he did not want MUFON to use any of the money for operational expenses. In other words, he didn't want MUFON field investigators to have equipment, to use the money to purchase equipment that they would need in the field, nor did he want to see the money go to MUFON overhead for office expenses, for example. So right off the bat, we had a problem because we had a straightforward purchase agreement, but then Mr. Bigelow was dictating how we were going to spend the money that was MUFON's. And what happened was there were two review periods built into the contract, one in June of 2009 and one in October. And when June rolled around, we got a letter from Mr. Bigelow saying, well, we don't understand why you have all this money left over from the project in the bank. It should be spent on the project. So we're going to reduce our funding. And that's what they did. So effectively, they invalidated their own contract, their own straightforward purchase agreement. When October of 2009 rolled around, they wanted to cut the funding even further, and when we tried to negotiate that with them, they stopped sending checks altogether. So basically, they had very tight control of the purse strings, and the money was to go just towards services that benefited them, with no thought of any long-term operational funding for MUFON. But this is the problem I think we have to begin with, is that we had money coming in for UFO investigation, the collection of data, and that data was going to BASS, and they were using their funds, whoever their sponsored funds were, to massage the data or to do scientific analysis, but that was never shared with MUFON. So we have this problem again of data being collected but not analyzed.
What was supposed to happen at the end of the year? Was there a renewal clause, or?
There was. They would then evaluate the contract over the year and see if it was worth continuing the relationship.
I guess the question would be, why did MUFON agree to this deal with Bigelow? What was the thinking on the MUFON camp? What did they expect to get out of it?
Well, I think what we expected to get out of it was fairly simple. We were looking for funding to get our investigators out in the field on high-quality cases, and to gather evidence quickly and then have it analyzed at labs. And so the relationship was to fund our what's called a MUFON STAR team, this rapid deployment team, to get out to the location of very significant events, collect the data that we required, send it to BASS. BASS would have it analyzed and then share the results of the analysis with MUFON. The problem was that the funding itself was, if you read the contract, it's a per month, it was a per month agreement. In other words, we would get a fixed price each month, and I specifically asked Mr. Bigelow, well, what about money's left over at the end of each month? And he said, okay, well, that's MUFON's money. So we were also looking at it as we're going to make some profit off of this that we could use then to fund our own scientific analysis. But the problem was that they didn't, BASS, after controlling the purse strings as they did, all that money that was sent to MUFON ended up just covering the operational expenses of getting our investigators out to the field for data collected.
Looking at the agreements, there were out clauses that allowed MUFON to withdraw from the agreement at any time if you wanted to. Is that correct? Upon a certain amount of notice and repayment of whatever money might be outstanding.
Well, what happened was, Paul, that in June of 2009, when we got this letter from BASS telling MUFON they wanted to reduce our contract amount, and if you look at the contract itself, it plainly states that there were three options that could have been taken or could be chosen by BASS during that renewal period. One was to keep the funding at the level it was per month. The second option was to terminate the contract, and the third one was to increase it. Nowhere in there is a clause that says they were going to reduce it. So my argument to the board was, they're taking an illegal action here. We should terminate the contract. But the board saw it as saw this funding as sort of the dream of getting the benefactor they wanted all this time that would fund MUFON long term, and so they caved into Mr. Bigelow's demands, and they accepted the reduced amount. So sure, we should have terminated, or MUFON should have terminated the contract back in June of 2009 when they took their own illegal action.
So when you negotiated it, you thought it was one thing and it turned out to be another thing, and at that point you recommended that MUFON walk away from it. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And if you read the contract, I think it was purposely, the language in there is purposely vague. Because, for example, when I think there's a clause in the contract that states that MUFON will provide access to BASS, will provide BASS access to their historical files. And when we sent historical files to BASS, they didn't see that there was a dollar value attached to that. So in other words, when we were giving them expense reports at the end of each month, the expense reports were for sending investigators out to the field and all the expenses related to that. But they never really saw, as the contract states, that they were buying information, especially our historical files. So I think they were arguing that, and the language was purposely set up to be vague, so that at a later time they could tell MUFON, well, we don't really feel like we're getting what we're paying for.
Now, on your blog, which is followthemagicthread.blogspot.com, you have a post that you wrote on Tuesday, February 8th, called Hunting the Skinwalker. I think most people would be aware of the Skinwalker Ranch and the work that Nids and Colm Kelleher and others did around there, in the book, of course, that came out. And you write, the very first line, it says, "It was after uncovering some disturbing information about the Skinwalker Ranch, owned by Robert Bigelow, that I," meaning you, James Carrion, "began to have doubts about the real purpose behind the MUFON BASS project." What were those doubts? Why did the information that you got about, what was the information about the Skinwalker Ranch, and why did it begin to raise doubts in your mind about the entire MUFON BASS project?
Well, let me go back to 2008. I was involved with a TV show on the Discovery Channel called UFOs Over Earth, and we were looking for material for the show, and I thought, you know what, why don't we just go out and do a piece on the Skinwalker Ranch? So I contacted Mr. Bigelow, and he said, no, we don't really want any more publicity about the ranch, especially on TV, so we're denying you access. And I could sort of understand that. If they didn't want to publicize that there was all this paranormal or alleged paranormal activity going on, they didn't want more curiosity seekers trespassing. Well, when 2009 rolled around and we signed this contract with BASS, and we were already well into it, I had actually spoken with Dr. Frank Salisbury earlier at the MUFON Symposium, and he told me that he was doing an update on his book called the Utah UFO Display, and he would be interviewing folks surrounding the Skinwalker Ranch, neighbors and other folks that claimed to have strange experiences. And I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go out there and join him in his investigation. And that's what I did. And it turned out that Mr. Bigelow refused not only Dr. Frank Salisbury's access to the ranch, but he also refused my request for access as well. So I could understand back in 2008 why they refused the Discovery Channel access because they didn't want more publicity. But here I was as an individual investigator with another investigator we were doing legitimate research, and we were refused access. So what we did instead is we interviewed the neighbors around the ranch. We interviewed a number of folks that even historical cases in the surrounding area. But I think the thing that really made me start to question, or two things that made me start to question whether there was true activity on the ranch, was we were able to find the brother of the former owner of the ranch, the owners that sold it to the Shermans, who then subsequently sold it to Mr. Bigelow. And the brother of the owner, who had been on the ranch many times, had stayed on the ranch many times because his sister and brother-in-law had owned it for a number of years, was adamant that there was no paranormal activity at all, no UFOs, no strange creatures, no strange events on this ranch prior to the Shermans buying it. And that made me think, wait a minute, there's something not right here. The second thing was interviewing one of the people that worked on the ranch, a story he told about rods being discovered on the ranch, I guess around a mutilated cow. And those rods were sent off to NIDS, because it was NIDS, the predecessor to BASS, that was doing the investigations at the time. That NIDS scientist came back and told this gentleman, well, these are element 115 rods. And I know that because I worked at Area 51, where we had accumulated 300 pounds of this material. So this NIDS scientist was repeating to this worker, this ranch worker, which is what is essentially the Bob Lazar story, which we all know in ufology to be a farce and to be something that's not true. So given these different strange, or this new information where no paranormal activity prior to Sherman's buying it, and also this repeating of the Bob Lazar story, I began to question what's really happening.
If you take all of that together, you could form a circumstantial argument, at least, that would say that what has been reported at the Skinwalker Ranch is not accurate. You might even be able to go so far, and I certainly know a number of skeptics who would say it was all made up for whatever reason. Is that possibility, do you think, real?
Well, what I think is going on is that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. Somebody is trying to convince the general public that this is a high concentration of paranormal activity. I'm not sure for what reason. Maybe it's because, let's just hypothesize there's U.S. government involvement here. The more they publicize, well, one, they're contributing to the UFO myth, and two, maybe there's actual activity on the ranch that's not paranormal, but more of a terrestrial nature, along the lines of non-lethal weapons testing, or drug-induced mind manipulation. Who knows what could possibly be doing, what could possibly be happening on this ranch where all of these strange characters show up, all of these folks from various intelligence agencies. So I don't know what's actually happening on the ranch right now, but I do know that according to the former relative of the owner, that nothing was happening before. So the book itself that claims a long history of paranormal activity is just not true. Now, I got an email from George Knapp, the co-author of the book Hunt for the Skinwalker, and he was pretty upset about my views. But at the same time, I remember when I talked to George at the symposium in 2009, I point blank asked him, George, you've been on the ranch a number of times. Did you ever experience anything paranormal yourself? And he was very clear, no. So he wrote the book, and basically it's anecdotal evidence that he's been hearing from other folks, and he repeated what other folks told him, but he really had no confirmation himself that the activity was happening. The problem we have here is somebody is spinning a yarn, and they're trying to get the general population to believe it. And some people, even with this evidence I've brought forward, are still going to believe it. But I don't think there's anything highly strange happening on that ranch. And if there is, it's more of a terrestrial nature.
What you have just described, with the possible involvement of intelligence agencies for whatever reason, and a journalist that reports anecdotal evidence but has never experienced anything himself, and the possibility that there might be some hoaxing going on, it reminds me of the 1948 Aztec UFO incident, which was then reported by gossip columnist Frank Scully in a book called Behind the Flying Saucers. And when it all fell apart, it turned out that the two guys, Leo Gebauer and Silas Newton, who were running this thing, giving their information to Scully, were con men. And so that would be a straight hoax, except for the fact that U.S. intelligence agencies, in particular the FBI, became interested in the story and started interviewing people and started wondering perhaps if there was some truth to this, but even more so, where are they getting their information? Who are these guys? What's going on here? And have they tapped into something maybe that we're doing that they're just misrepresenting as something else? Which leads me to my segue, which is your views on the intelligence community and its relationship to the UFO phenomenon and groups like MUFON and internet forums like Above Top Secret. Is that kind of stuff that was going on back in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, that was certainly going on during the Paul Benowitz saga, which my good friend Greg Bishop has documented in Project Beta, is that stuff still going on today?
Well, I think you really have to go back to the very beginning of the modern UFO era, and even back to Kenneth Arnold's story. My research into Maury Island, Kenneth Arnold, and Roswell leads me to believe that these are actually three UFO myths that were purposely created by elements within the intelligence agency to kickstart the whole UFO mythology. If you look at the circumstances around Kenneth Arnold's sighting and his investigation of the Maury Island hoax, the more you start seeing a pattern of deception and manipulation. For example, when he went out to investigate in Tacoma, the Maury Island, when he went to interview the Maury Island witnesses, and he flies into Tacoma unannounced, and he doesn't have a place to stay, and he calls around, and lo and behold, somebody has made a reservation under his name at the Winthrop Hotel. And then in his own book, Coming to the Saucers, he talks about how he thought his room was bugged, and all the strange circumstances surrounding that. That reeks of intelligence agency involvement. Not to mention that the Winthrop Hotel was right across the street from the UPI newswire. Somebody wanted his story to get out. They were trying to push his story to the mass media. And I think back then it was actually a Cold War operation to try to convince the Russians we had something they didn't. And if you read some of my research papers about that, I can actually show this pattern of activity. And I have much more research to do, but I think the intelligence agency involvements is at the very beginning of the whole UFO era. And I think they were successful at it, and since then they've used the subject for everything from covering up what the latest stealth fighter or bomber is, to psychological warfare, to now what I believe, especially when we're dealing with these message boards like the Open Minds Forum and Above Top Secret, is information warfare, manipulating public opinion and pushing a message that through anonymous information that I think even has connections to WikiLeaks. So I think the intelligence agencies are using the UFO field as the proving grounds for whatever societal or information warfare they want to perpetrate. And what a better way to do it than to play around with the minds of these gullible believers.
Perhaps you could talk a bit more about this information war aspect that you're talking about, because there are real groups out there that provide or that represent, at least in the minds of the establishment, a real threat to their power and their interests. You can see some of them on the streets whenever there's a WTO protest, and clearly the government is infiltrating those groups and acting against them in the same way that they used to act against and infiltrate groups in the 1960s. So that I get. There's no question that that kind of thing goes on. But why the UFO phenomenon? What is the current membership, if you know, roughly, of MUFON? 2,000 maybe people, is it?
I would think somewhere close to 3,000.
In a country of over 300 million people, if you have an organization that has 3,000 people in it, and I've asked around, friends of mine, not just here in Canada, but down in the United States, nobody knows who MUFON is. So why target an organization like MUFON? What's the end game for them there in terms of trying to get information out or do whatever they're supposedly doing? Perhaps you could expand on that a bit.
Well, I think we're dealing with two different things here. On the message boards and this information warfare I'm talking about is one aspect of control. The other aspect of control, just from, let's take, for example, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Their job is to protect all of these special access projects that have to deal with high-tech development of future aircraft. So they have a vested interest in pushing UFO mythology because it provides a perfect cloaking or cover for their testing and development of that. But I think just in terms of what MUFON does, MUFON actually is a problem from an intelligence agency perspective, because what it does is it goes out there and investigates these supposedly strange things flying around the atmosphere. And so I think there's concern that information is reaching our enemies over the internet, meaning the Russians and the Chinese, as instant intelligence. So, and this has actually been documented in the MUFON files. So there was a gentleman in Utah who was fishing in a lake and saw something strange flying overhead. He took a picture of it. He posted it on MUFON's website, and lo and behold, it was a Boeing aircraft that was a top secret aircraft. And anybody around the world had instant access to that. So I think they see MUFON as sort of an intelligence source that they have to control, to plug any leaks, or just to push disinformation. So there are many reasons why they may be interested in MUFON, just from an intelligence perspective.
Sure, and that's the bit I'll buy, that you have things flying around in our skies that are clearly, and after the fact, years later, you can see that something that was reported 20 years ago, you can look back now and say, oh yes, okay, that wasn't a UFO, that was one of ours. So I can clearly understand why the intelligence agencies would be interested in a group like MUFON, because they're out there, or their people are out there taking pictures, collecting data of things that are ours. The interesting thing to me, though, is you realize that, you accept that. Where does that leave the UFO phenomenon, though? Is there still something out there that predates 1947, Roswell, Kenneth Arnold, which you say were intelligence-run operations? So is there still a mystery to the UFO phenomenon, or is this all just a creation of various intelligence agencies for purposes that have nothing to do with any sort of mystery? How do you square the two?
Well, I don't necessarily square the two. I just know that based on the size of our universe, the chance that there is not intelligent life out there is nil. There is intelligent life out there, obviously. The question is, has it arrived here? And I think that a lot of UFO proponents, for them, it's a definite yes, and then they'll cite Kenneth Arnold and Maury Island or Roswell as evidence of that, which, if I can prove that it was an intelligence operation, is basically going to cause this house of ufology to fall flat. But then again, there are folks that don't care about that, whether it was an intelligence operation or not. They'll go back and they'll look at ancient evidence and historical writings and the pyramids and whatever else. The bottom line is, we don't have any solid evidence that we have extraterrestrial visitation going on. There is no solid scientific evidence of that. And you can try to lump it all in one big bucket of ufology, but the bottom line is, you're not going to get to the truth unless you're willing to compartmentalize the information that's there. There may be a true phenomena, we may have real visitation, but until we can peel away these very human layers of deception, we're simply never going to know what that core phenomena is.
Let's follow the intelligence thing a little further down the rabbit hole for a second and talk about a couple of particular cases where people have indicated that at least some people think there might have been an intelligence aspect to it as opposed to an extraterrestrial or whatever aspect to it. Rendlesham, the 1980 Rendlesham Forest case in the United Kingdom. Do you think that that case might be something that involved, rather than extraterrestrials, some sort of intelligence operation?
Oh, I think it's very, very possible. I mean, if we look even back at the history of some of these psychological manipulation experiments they've done from through MK Ultra, and the nastiness of what the CIA was up to, it's very well possible that what happened there in Rendlesham was a mind control experiment of some sort.
The entire abduction phenomenon, or enigma as Kevin Randle has called it. What do you make of that? In particular, what do you make of a case like the Betty and Barney Hill case? And do you think there might be an intelligence agency involvement there as well?
Well, I think the abduction phenomena is actually very interesting. I don't discount it at all, especially since I've done some personal investigations into abduction cases that, for me, are actually even more compelling than the Betty and Barney Hill story, and for which I have no explanation for. But I think we go back to this central question: is just because folks are experiencing strange things that supposedly is extraterrestrial related, is it really extraterrestrial? Is there an alternative explanation? In other words, I think that if you talk to any abduction researcher these days, the common thread for most abductions is deception, where those folks who are being abducted are being fed information that is obviously not truthful, or they're being deceived in some way. So where is that deception coming from? Is it from a terrestrial source? In other words, are these more mind control experiments? Or is somebody really coming down and abducting humans? And who are these folks? Are they from outside, or have they always been here? We don't know. So it's a general mystery, for sure. And I don't discount it at all. But I can't just put a ET label on it and say, okay, that's the explanation for it, like some folks want to do.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think most abduction cases can be explained, I think there is still a small residue. I think it's a small residue, but I think there are still cases of interest, and there always have been. I agree with you, though, that ufology or UFO research, not everyone, but a lot, the primary strand within it, the one that the public is certainly most familiar with, is the extraterrestrial idea. And I think they've been far too quick and too eager to promote that at the expense of what I think, from just chatting with you, what you and I sort of take away from it, what interests people like us, which is the mystery, the fact that we don't know the answers, which is why we keep looking. Which leads me to, I guess, my last question, which is, what's next for James Carrion? Where do you go now in terms of your own personal journey, as we filmmakers would say, in trying to discover the truth about the UFO phenomenon or the paranormal in general? What's the future hold for you?
Well, I'm pretty much focused right now on my own personal research into that 2-month period of 1947 that covers Maury Island, Kenneth Arnold, and Roswell. And to research it from my theory point of view, which is it was an intelligence operation. And I think I would like to get those questions answered in my own mind first, and also I have a lot of research to do in government archives in order to do that. I'm not going to try to pursue the ultimate truth of what is this all about, because I don't think there's a way for us to tackle ufology that way. I think you have to be very compartmentalized in your approach, and there are multiple possibilities and multiple answers. So I think I'm focused on the intelligence agency aspect of things, and what have the intelligence agencies been up to, and how much have they been involved in this field.
Is there anything else you want to discuss or say, or sort of any final concluding remarks you'd like to make? I open the floor to you.
Well, I think what I would want to tell your listeners is that if you want to be in this field, number one, you have to have a high tolerance for ambiguity. Number two, if you find yourself at either end of the spectrum, either as a diehard believer or as a diehard debunker, you're going to find your truth because their minds are already made up. If you're really looking to discover what this mystery is about and not just perpetuate the mystery, then you need to take a skeptical position, and you have to have an open mind. But you really have to think about it in terms of what other folks are telling you from either end of the spectrum may not actually be the truth, and discover the truth for yourself. So you have to do the hardcore research, and as Stan Friedman is fond of saying, you can't be an armchair ufologist. You better get out there and make it happen.
Couldn't agree with you more. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. I've been talking to James Carrion, former international director of the Mutual UFO Network, and now private seeker of the truth. Like all of us, I suppose, at the end of the day, it's really a question of satisfying our own curiosity about what remains, to me, and I think to you too, James, an enduring mystery. Thanks for doing the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it as well.